Hello, I'm John Powell. This oral history interview is with Donald Schneider, former chief clerk of the state senate, who presided for 26 years over the state senate, not presided, but served as the clerk. And thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Well, let's start off with a little bit of your background. You're a Wisconsin native?
Yes, I'm a Wisconsin native. I was born in Sheboygan and graduated from high school in Montello, went into the service, went to school here in Madison, and actually began working for the legislature part-time in 1970. A time of great change for the legislature.
Had you ever thought of that as a career? Were you aiming for a career in government?
Well, politics were somewhat in my blood, and yes, I at one time thought about it. I enjoyed working at the Capitol once I was there, but even prior to that, I was always interested in politics, going back to my younger days. My father actually was in the legislature for 6 years, from 1945 to 51. So that put it in my blood, and we visited the Capitol often, and I guess it stayed there.
As which party, your father?
He was a Democrat.
Oh, from Sheboygan?
From Sheboygan.
In that era?
When there was only 8.
There were very few Democrats then. How did he manage that?
He actually came over from the service, and the owner of the Sheboygan Press, Matt Werner, thought that he should run. He had been a member of the city council there, and he is the only one who ever defeated Ernie Kepler, who was a state senator for a long time, as you know, from Sheboygan. So history goes back a long time, and when he became clerk, Ernie was still state senator.
But that was a Republican era. There were hardly any Democrats in the legislature at that time.
That is true, and he was successful, and actually what caused his defeat probably more than his own voting record was the fact that in 1952, I guess it would have been...
the Eisenhower sweep?
Well, the Eisenhower, but also Kohler. And Kohler, being from Sheboygan for all practical purposes, swept the area, and he was defeated at that time.
So had you been thinking about elective office?
I certainly had those thoughts. However, I worked in the Assembly, and in the 1971 session was a transition that we had changed the Constitution to provide for annual sessions of the legislature, and it was somewhat of a follow-on to the efforts in the 60s led by David Obey and Fred Risser and Tiny Krieger and Wayne Widow and others to strengthen the legislature and increase its capacity. That constitutional amendment passed. It became far more active. Members received a pay increase that year that was quite substantial. We had a huge turnover. The Republicans had controlled the Assembly. But when they woke up in November of 1970, the Democrats had a 2/3 majority.
That was a huge turnover.
A huge turnover. And Bob Huber was Speaker, a great parliamentarian and a great politician. But I recognized that they were doing this immense growth without any real direction or planning and management. The clerk's positions were still partisan at that time. They functioned more part-time than full-time. They had a very limited staff, but suddenly you were responsible for human resource activity and expenditures to manage a legislative staff function that was growing leaps and bounds. They really changed the structure of the legislature at the time. I lost my interest in the elected part of the legislature and thought, this place looks like we could do something from the management end. And I changed my direction, and I became a product of the legislature that I didn't want to leave. I really did enjoy the entire time I was there.
Now, the Watergate turnaround didn't happen until '74, as far as Democrats having advantage. Why in 1970 for the Assembly?
There was a big dispute between the conservative Republicans, led by Harold Freilich, who later became a judge, and Warren Knowles, who was a very moderate Republican governor. And because of that dispute, I mean, they were refusing to pass the budget. The Senate was controlled by Republicans, but by moderate Republicans like Tiny Krieger and Bob Knowles and Walter John Chilson. So they had a different relationship. And it was really, I think people were tired of the conflict. Somewhat we're hearing now because of the inaction that caused that huge turnover.
So gridlock is not brand new.
No, it's not. It repeats itself sometimes, history does.
So in '71, you get hired by the Assembly.
Yes. As a full-time employee then.
Was that advertised? I mean, how
No,
would that go in the yellow pages or the want ads at the time?
No, I was attending university, had done some part-time work as a messenger. And when the new session was organizing after the elections, I stopped in to speak with the people who were going to serve as clerk and sergeant at arms, and sought a position, put in my application, and I was actually hired on the sergeant staff at that time to do their payrolls and supervise pages at that time.
So you'd been a page.
Yes.
And
yes.
Quite a number of people, later some elected officials too, started out as pages.
Yes, Governor Thompson served as a page in the State Assembly. So yes, many people have, many legislators and other staff people. It was a great training ground. You learned a great deal.
What kinds of things do you do as a page?
Well, you do...
you're a gopher, basically.
You're a gopher, but at the time when we've gone paperless, of course, in the Assembly with technology, one of the biggest efforts we had was all of the bills were on all of the desks for the members. And they were tied with shoestrings in big binders. And you had to file those bills every day. Now you have maybe 1,500 bills in a 2-year session between the two houses. Back then you had over 2,000, almost 3,000 just in the Assembly. And,
wow.
And the Senate would introduce about 1,200. And they were all printed and brought in. You would have to collate them, of course. Take these big volumes, pull the shoestrings out, because Senate Bill 5 now had an amendment in, so you had to pull all the rest of them out, string the amendment to Senate Bill 5, time back in. We had 60 or 70 pages that the majority of their time when we were not in session would be filing those bills very late into the night, because you had to have them available for the next day's session. The sessions were also longer. It was most common that the Assembly would convene at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. They would break for lunch, but they would not break for dinner. But they would normally go to midnight, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and continue that through Thursday, and try to convene on Friday and adjourn by noon. As we got later into the session, they would even meet well past midnight on a Friday night. And the session also continued. Budget was supposed to be passed by June 30th. Pat Lucy was governor. I think it was our first $1 billion budget. Had a great deal of policy change being made because of the political differences between having Democratic control of the executive branch in the Assembly, that they were coming forward with a wealth of new programs. And the budget continued to go on. Now, a lot of employees, and in fact even maybe myself, because of the reduction of staffing when they adjourned after budget, we thought by July 1 we'd be laid off. Budget wasn't passed. The Senate did not want to go along with the Assembly. They in fact introduced their own budget at one point, and it went until the end of November. And during that time period, we also merged the university systems, reorganized the Department of Transportation, did a lot of internal things to state government that caused a lot of debate and long session hours. So it was a very different time period, and the pages, of course, in addition to doing the books, like you'd asked, they were the gophers. And they provided the meals for the members into the parlor area. They brought them copies of all of the documents that were being added after the session started. They staffed the committee meetings. We had public hearings all the time, non-session days. And committees were very active to travel throughout the state. It would not be uncommon for us to have 3 or 4 standing committees of the Assembly meeting at various locations throughout the state, because it was a new thing to do as part of strengthening the legislative process.
So you didn't get laid off after the budget passed?
Didn't get laid off, continued on, and worked for the Assembly for another 5 years. A total of 6 years before I moved to the Senate in 1977.
People still complain about the late night sessions and so forth, but it sounds like it was even worse then.
Oh yes, I think it was far worse then, because we would continue Not just one night periodically or maybe two. This was week after week after week that you would not go home until midnight or later. And of course the clerk staff at that time didn't have the computers. The journals had to be handwritten. They were turned over to a printer who then put them in type and had to print them and deliver them by 8 o'clock the next morning. And the clerk staff had to be back at 8 o'clock the next morning. Compensatory time was, no one got overtime. You could have taken off a year, but no one ever had the opportunity to do that because we stayed in session.
And the number of bills surprises me a little bit. People were complaining. I guess it's been down in the last couple of sessions, the number of bills introduced. But 3,000 in the Assembly alone? My goodness.
Well, part of it, I think, was you had a huge turnover of members. So, of course, they wanted to demonstrate to their constituents that they were going to have an impact on their lives and state government, so there was a lot of new ideas flowing out. You also, because of the fact that the legislature was going to meet in an annual session, they no longer had bills dying at the end of a 90-day cycle, that there was a lot of legislation that prior to that they knew couldn't move, they couldn't bring it forward, so you had all these programs coming forward. It also, just because of that movement that was going throughout the country of legislatures increasing their capacity, they wanted to exert that power over the executive and really scrutinize what the executive branch of government was doing. And on the other hand, you had a governor such as Governor Lucey, who had experience in the legislature and as lieutenant governor and had a vision for the state of Wisconsin that was reorganizing it, which also then contributed to more legislation to provide oversight for this new form of government.
Well, what about the power of the legislature? Now, in Wisconsin, the governor, with that huge partial veto power, not an item veto power, he can rewrite legislation and effectively legislate.
Yes.
Now, I know you've been instrumental and many of the leaders in trying to increase the power of the legislature as compared to the governor. Has that been successful? How do you go about that?
Well, we've gone through a process where the governors have increased and been more innovative in how they use that partial veto and how it's been defined by the courts. So we've certainly seen greater use of it. Back when I first started in the 70s, it was there, but it hadn't been pushed quite as far. So the legislature lost some ground in that area. But where they truly gained was when you increased the capacity of the total staff service to the legislators. Starting with things such as the Fiscal Bureau and the Legislative Audit Bureau, and increasing the capacity of the Legislative Reference Bureau, which has been a long-standing service agency, but their ability to draft and giving them greater staff resource for research and drafting attorneys. The Legislative Council took more of an active role in the actual legislative process. When the council was created in '47, it was this link with the public. It was truly an innovative idea in Wisconsin to bring people from the general public into the legislative process, appoint them to committees where they had a vote on developing a study report on a particular issue.
These would be the study committees.
These would
that
be
were
the study
commissioned by the council.
And that was the main focus of the council. In the late 60s and early 70s, that really began changing to where they provided greater staff support to the standing committees in addition to doing the study committees. So it increased the legislators' capacity to deal with the issues. And more importantly, what it did, we changed certain laws and we gave the legislative staff agencies the authority to have access to executive branch information. Department of Revenue had to give information immediately to the Fiscal Bureau so they could do their tax projections, and Department of Administration had to provide their data on expenditures from all the agencies on a monthly basis. The Legislative Audit Bureau was given the full authority to go in and not only do financial audits, but what has become a very important part of the legislative process is program evaluation audits, where they can not only look at where the dollars have been spent, but is the program being managed the way the legislators legislature intended it to be, and is it accomplishing the goals that the legislature had set out in legislation. Those things began truly increasing the capacity, generated more legislation on behalf of the legislature.
Now, these were done by law.
These were done by law.
So Governor Lucey had to sign them.
Yes, yes. And there was many efforts of negotiating how this would work. The other area that was a major rub between the executive branch and the legislature was the administrative rule oversight. It took years and it took court determinations to get to the process we have now, which is very cumbersome, difficult for many people to understand, including staff and legislators who work with it. But yet it does provide the legislature's authority to look at rules being promulgated by the executive branch of government to implement the legislative intent. We didn't have that before.
Now, the way that works, as I understand it, the standing committee that deals with that subject matter of the rule
Yes.
in either house can essentially put a hold on it.
Yes,
Say, we disagree.
yes.
But then, if the legislature wants to overturn it, they have to pass a bill.
That is
to
correct.
do it by law.
That is correct.
So it's not exactly a...
It's not a pure thing, but it's our separation of powers doctrine. It was not acceptable to the courts for the legislature just to take full authority to either approve or deny requests from an agency to promulgate a rule. And Governor Thompson, as a member of the legislature, even though in the minority, was very supportive of making some changes. His views maybe changed on that when he became governor. But we went through that entire process. Dave Berger played instrumental roles in accomplishing that, as well as Bob Knowles, to get to the point where by at least providing that, the executive branch had to submit a draft rule into the legislative process so that it was widely broadcast in public. Public hearings could be conducted. The committee could, in fact, delay final promulgation of that rule by asking for the agency to come forward at a hearing and justify it. And if it still could not be resolved, because there is a mechanism where a committee could make recommendations to an agency to modify the rule, they don't have to abide by that. But having that process creates a great deal of dialogue to ultimately come up with a compromise on many of the rules that
Sometimes
go
the
through
agencies do modify as the
They will,
committees.
and I think we've seen more of that as the process has gone in. There are times, of course, when a committee does object. Then it requires it to go to a joint committee where they introduce a bill, and the bill must go through the legislative process, and ultimately the governor has the final say. Because
that almost never happens. Right? Has it ever happened?
I don't
that
believe
a rule
it.
has been overturned.
I don't believe it ever
law.
has. I'd have to double check to make sure on that, John.
But it does put together an atmosphere of negotiation,
Yes.
of public scrutiny
Yes.
anyway.
And it again gave that opportunity for the legislature to exert oversight over what the executive branch of government is doing.
Now, I'm sure to many people this is arcane insider stuff, the legislative
Yes.
rules, and what does that mean to me? But in terms of outcome, it can be important.
Oh, extremely important. If you really look back at history, when you particularly take a look at the recent history, the 50s and 60s, and the authority that governors had, where in the 60s we created state agencies, expanded the executive authority, but yet the legislature was a 90-day wonder every 2 years. It met very infrequently, had weak committee structure, did not have the authority to force information from the executive branch of government. The governor had all the budget resources. The legislature had no fiscal bureau staff at that time, had to rely totally on the executive branch of government for all the information to make decisions. By providing the legislature the tools necessary, and that they have today and are continuing to strengthen, you develop alternatives, and you generate a dialogue, and you bring in more public input, and ultimately you come up with a better product to better serve the people of the state of Wisconsin than I think we would have had we not strengthened our legislative process.
Yet people still say we ought to go back to that part-time legislature, pay them $3,000 a year, and they only come here 90 days, and they have real jobs, and they'll be more in touch with the public, and the legislature is too big, and well, anyway, you know that.
Oh yes, you hear that argument. And that is because the legislature's closer to the constituents. They're more public, they're more visible, they're scrutinized by the media, they're at home with their constituents, and so when people have a grievance with state government, it generally falls to the legislature. They might write a letter to the editor or to the governor, but most often they make that phone call, or they go knock on the door, or they stop their legislator at the local restaurant when they see them. And so their frustrations can be brought out to the legislature, and they blame them. But when you look at what state government does today, and the fact that we now have $20+ billion annual budget to fulfill the needs of state government and education in this state, to take all of that and put that into the hands of people who were here for 90 days, and the governor submitted a budget in January and had all the documentation and said, this is what we need to do, here's all the reasons why, and you don't have an opportunity to ask questions or to develop any alternative, pretty close to a dictatorship in my opinion, and I don't think people would be satisfied with that. The legislature's an easy target. Let's take them away and that'll solve our problem. When the fact is that the legislative budget is a very small percentage of the cost of total state government, but yet its impact is widely felt on all of the programs, and I think better serves the people to meet their needs, even though they may disagree at times.
Well, let's talk about the growth of professionalism of legislative staff. At the time you started, typically, and maybe this is still true in other states, I haven't kept up on it, the sergeant-at-arms and the clerks were, well, a member of the majority party who'd lost a bid for re-election and needed a job. I mean, that was basically how those positions were filled.
Stated pretty well, yes.
But we've switched over to professionalism, and you were in on the ground floor of that, really.
Yes.
How did that go, and what happened?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I somewhat changed my position as I looked at the legislature back in the early 70s already, and divorced myself from the partisan politics of the election to look at the internal operations and the administration of the assembly. What was happening is that you had a growth in staffing. You went to where instead of one person maybe staffing and serving as a committee clerk for 4 different committees, because the committees were so much more active, you not only had one legislative council staff person assigned to them, but you had a full-time staff person for that particular committee. You gave members greater authority with communicating with their own constituents. In 1970, if you wanted to write, and you were not in leadership and you wanted to respond to correspondence from your legislature, you went to the clerk's office. They gave you a pre-printed postcard that said, thank you very much for your correspondence on, and you could write in whatever you wanted to and sign it and send it back. That was a total resource that a member had, unless he used his own personal resources. Committee staff would try to do letters when they had opportunities during the interim from the members of their committee, but that's somewhat how legislators had to communicate. Didn't have the offices, they worked out of the desks in the chambers.
Their office was their desk on the floor.
But yet you were exposed to the demands of the people. As legislators made baby steps to increasing the capacity and power of the legislature, people recognized that and were communicating more with them. So they kind of self-perpetuated each other. As one got stronger, the other needed more resources. So you saw a rapid increase in administrative staff directly for the members. I'll refer to them as partisan staff. But to help manage all of that, you certainly had to have the centralized staff of the clerks in the sergeant's office, as well as our service agencies outside of the houses to serve both houses. I wrote a letter to Speaker Anderson, actually, in 1973, and at that time, because it was still very much ingrained that partisan clerks would be elected, and they served basically part-time, that maybe the House should consider, the Assembly should consider hiring a manager to work with the clerk, but have the responsibility for administration of the House from financial and operational aspects of the non-legislative business. That didn't happen. Norm Anderson was defeated in a primary election after that for the open meetings lawsuits. But what happened was then we started institutionalizing some of those things on our own without a directive from leadership to put some things into place. With Tom Melvin, who was a longstanding assistant chief clerk of the Assembly, and myself, we were able to start doing some things.
So were you the first sort of nonpartisan professional clerk?
Yes, I guess I could say that. In 1976, Glenn Baltman, who was a former member of the Assembly, Democrats had taken control in 1975 of the Senate for the first time in 80 years. They elected Glenn as the chief clerk. And he
Was he a defeated member? Or?
No, he had just chose not to run, actually. Redistricting caused a change in his district, and he decided not to run. And actually had thought of doing things in Milwaukee. I don't think they worked out, so he came back and was successful in getting the job as the clerk, but did serve as a partisan clerk, part-time. And he let it be known in '76 that he did not want to continue in that capacity and was going to return to Milwaukee. And he actually came to my office and he said, "Don, I'm going to make this announcement, but you should seriously think about replacing me as clerk." He said, "I think you have some good ideas that maybe would help the Senate." I thought about that. I knew some of the people because you do have a transition of members from the Assembly to the Senate. I knew some of the other people there, but it wasn't really my thing. And at that time, there was somewhat of a divide between the two houses. And you worked for the Assembly, you were proud of the Assembly. That Senate was the other house, and you did things differently. But I ultimately decided that I would do that. I submitted a letter to the members of the majority party because it was clearly going to be their decision on my thoughts on management for the Senate, looking at technology and some other things that I thought we ought to be doing for the future, developing policies in certain areas and how we conducted our finances and so forth. There were a number of other former members and former party officials that were seeking the position also. They were doing more of a lobbying effort, knocking on doors and contacting members. I chose not to do that. And for whatever reason, ultimately, they set up a committee to make a recommendation. Consisted of Senator Fred Risser, Bill Bablich, and Jerry Kletchka. They interviewed me and advised me shortly thereafter that I would be their nominee to be clerk. And so I was elected clerk 2 weeks before the session began.
Now, were they consciously hoping that you would be continuing into the indefinite future? I mean, like when the Republicans took over, which did happen, but I mean, were they thinking of that at the time?
Well, remotely. I mean, there was clearly, those people had an interest in wanting to see the Senate managed properly. We were doing many different things throughout this whole growth aspect to give members greater resources, ability to travel and get reimbursement for travel, and do different things for constituent communication, setting up home offices and providing them with phone services at their home. And you didn't have cell phones and those things at that time. But there weren't policies about that. There wasn't a real management of how you were going to do this. And because I had written this document originally to Norm Anderson that I did not share with him, but somebody had, because they had shared that document with me. But some of the things I mentioned in my original letter seeking the position, they focused on that. They really wanted someone to manage the body, and also, to all of their credit, to do so in a nonpartisan manner. I think they were tired of the situation where the majority party got the resources, got the committee chairmanships, were treated differently than what the minority party was. And they had been in the minority a long time. They took over in '75. They did some things to accommodate the minority. Didn't go all the way, that's human nature, but at least they started that process and had the thought process about it.
Now, prior to this, the majority party had selected the members of the minority party to serve on committees, right?
Yes.
So the minority party didn't have a choice as to who of their members they wanted to serve on a particular committee.
Absolutely
The majority party decided.
They really had, other than their voice during debate at a committee meeting or on the floor of the session, they had limited input into the legislative process. They were generally given less resources, even the ways as they began providing staff resources and office space. Minority Party got the smallest space, the least amount of staffing resources and other resources to do their job. And in '77, when I was elected and we had the discussions and the directions that they were giving me, it was all focused on what we developed would treat everyone equally. And yes, there were certain people that required additional resources, but if the majority leader needed more resources, that meant the minority leader also needed. Probably more than a freshman member of either party, but you didn't treat the freshman member of the minority different than the freshman member of the majority party. And that was really key. And that changed the attitude dramatically in the Senate because of treating everyone equally. So that in 1993, when we had the special elections and the Republicans took over, the night of the election, their leaders were talking to me about, we want you to stay, we want you to continue managing the House the way it has been, make sure we do the right things to keep the operational administrative functions separate from what we may do as partisans in legislation. And so that's...
How does Wisconsin stack up with other states in terms of this move toward professionalization?
The trend is certainly to see it all the way across the country. There's about 11 states that have taken it the distance that Wisconsin has to date, but it's been impacted everywhere. Even some states who were very slow to move that way, term limits have caused the necessity to have institutional memory and a stronger staff presence available because the members rotate so fast. You didn't have the long-term speaker. You might have a speaker who's only served 4 years suddenly running the entire operation. Not a very long period of time to learn the entire operation. So you find that clerks and sergeants throughout the country that were partisan are now considered to be nonpartisan. May still go through a selection process that reflects a partisan movement, but many have survived party changeover, and many now work in a capacity that once they are selected, they fulfill their duties in a nonpartisan capacity at all times.
Wisconsin's been a leader, at least in some areas of this. Obviously, the Legislative Reference Bureau being one of the first
Yes.
Ever state legislative bureaus, which goes back to, what, 1912 or something like that?
Yes, actually 1901. The
1901.
library was started in 12, so you're correct on that. But it's a very long-standing and the first staff.
And do other states have these, the Audit Bureau and the Fiscal Bureau and so forth?
Yes, and that has been in the centralized staff function areas where you've seen a growth across the country. The legislative fiscal bureaus you find in some capacity. Now, some states may have them as partisan staffs, or at least one for the Senate and one for the Assembly. I think Wisconsin has been unique, and I also think it's a good process where we have taken those functions for the joint efforts and kept them as joint efforts. Our bill drafting has always been, and hopefully will always remain, a consolidated joint service. Our fiscal bureau and our audit bureau and our legislative council staff, our technology staff, provide services across partisan boundaries and across the boundaries of the two autonomous houses. That is not always the case, but that's a cultural decision that's made by each legislative body, where you may find a technology staff, one for the Senate, one for the Assembly. Not as great of a problem today because technologies are easier to merge, but when you think back to the late 80s and early 90s, it was very difficult to get certain computer programs to cross that bridge.
One house could adopt one kind of computer and the other house another kind.
Absolutely.
And so then the clerks had,
Well, Alabama was a perfect example. There were others. A bill was drafted and passed in the Senate. When it was messaged over to the Assembly, they had to redraft it into their computer system in order to fully
Somebody had to
track the
retype
records.
it
They had to
then.
retype
Couldn't
it.
just switch it
Couldn't
over.
just switch it. There was no conversion program. Fortunately, Wisconsin has not done that, and that the culture here was to create these joint efforts, largely because of how the Reference Bureau was, followed on by the experience in 1947 with the Legislative Council. And then in the 60s, when you saw the Fiscal Bureau created, and in the 70s, the Audit Bureau, to continue those efforts. And then finally, our Legislative Technology Services Bureau, which was formalized in the 90s, existed, though, as a nonpartisan effort, even though they were executive branch employees assigned to the legislature before that.
You mentioned term limits. One of the arguments against it is that if you have term limits, you're turning over more power to the permanent staffs,
Yes.
and for that matter to the lobbyists,
Yes.
who have the expertise, and they're the ones that are always there. Do you agree with that?
I do. And I will go one step further, I think, also to the civil service and the executive branch, because that is where you have all of the knowledge. And for members to serve, in some states only 6 years, most of them 10, it takes some time to develop the expertise and to be able to look at the alternatives that staff has developed for you to consider and build a confidence enough to move forward with decisions on the direction you want to go. I was a staff person, and clearly it would made my life different and maybe easier had we had a continuous turnover of legislature. I'd been the total institutional memory. You can do different things much easier to convince people to your view.
No old timers to
no
say, hey,
old-timers.
you're wrong, we
Right.
did it.
We tried this before, or to have that influence. And that's important. And a senior legislator carries a different stature with them. They develop that statesperson perspective. If you're short-termed, you're a politician. You look at the quick and easy solution because you're looking either at that next election or, in fact, I'm gone. Let's decide it now and make a decision. I think that's one reason why you see differences between the Senate and the Assembly. The 4-year term, there's more time you have, and so as you are serving here longer, I think you look at the long-term solution for the state as opposed to a short-term palliative that answers it for today but might not be successful
Well, I guess
tomorrow.
one example would be our longest-serving legislator ever, Fred Risser,
Yes.
who's used his tremendous longevity to take an issue and push it session after session. He's not looking at the end of this session,
Right.
but whether it was seat belts or the issues that he's pushed, he's been able to push them a little farther, session after session after session.
Yes.
If you're against what he does, of course, that's not so good. But you do have that sort of institutional people within the system.
Yes, you do. And the contribution that your senior members can make, because on policy issues, they have seen some different things before, or they have debated them before, and so they can share those experience, whether in a formal setting of a session debate or even informally. But they're a check on the staff also. It's human nature to want to be in control of your own destiny and take advantage of certain situations. And our whole system of government is based on checks and balances, which is why I've always believed it's important to have a strong and effective legislature with the capacity to address the issues that the executive branch brings forward. You need that check and balance. And I firmly believe you need that within the legislative structure of having senior members. You need the mix with junior members and likewise with staffing to be a part of that.
Turnover is fairly high in the state legislature, especially in the Assembly. I haven't looked at it lately, but the average length of service isn't much more than 6 years, is it, in the Assembly?
No, we've seen a fair amount of turnover. I mean, you'll always have the examples of Senator Risser and Senator Ellis and Marlon Schneider as a state representative, and most often it's people like their legislator. They keep electing them, but it's mine that's the problem because he's been there too long or she's been there too long. But to some extent that really is a perception. There's a frustration by those who enter into the elected process that the opportunities are not there because an incumbent has inherent advantage by virtue of their name, identification, and the record that they've established. But I think we also have to keep in mind that they do have a record, and that is a way that people can make a decision about who that representative is. We don't have voter fraud. No one's forcing the people of Madison to re-elect Senator Risser as their state senator. So it is their choice to do so. We go through a redistricting process, which will be coming up in 2 years. A lot of people will look at that and say, you know, we ought to make wholesale changes to all the legislative boundaries, so we bring in a whole new group of people. I will argue that a legislative district in and of itself is a community of interest. I remember when we first broke county lines in 1971 and 2, which was a very difficult decision and forced upon the legislature by the U.S. Supreme Court.
The one man, one vote.
One man, one vote.
Because you couldn't, keeping a county together, you couldn't get the
equal representation.
The numbers of people in each district
That's
close
right.
enough.
So that was very difficult, but yet, so we've done that, but yet to wholesale and to look at redistricting and say, oh, we've got to cut these districts in half and suddenly bring in a whole new group of people, so you know the area of Monona may suddenly be paired with Fort Atkinson instead of with part of the city of Madison. That creates all kinds of conflicts for what I think is a community of interest that has been served by a legislator, that the people can re-elect someone else if they choose, but to just draw the line to bring about that change, I think there's other ramifications that haven't been considered.
As we speak, people are talking again about some sort of impartial bipartisan commission to do the redistricting, figuring the legislature can't do it for itself,
Right.
which it has not been able to do. It's gone to court the last, what,
Yes, it
3
has.
times?
Last time we adopted one was in 1982, redone in 83, I guess, when Tony Earl was governor, to make modifications. That was the last time, and the Democrats controlled the governor and both houses.
But in after the 90 census and the 2000 census, it went to court anyway.
Yes.
Is there a better way to do it?
I don't know that there's a better way to do it. It is currently a legislative prerogative to do that. Partisanship enters into it. It would be nice to remove some of that partisan aspect of looking at how we draw our boundaries, but I don't want to see it where they don't consider the community of interests that are already there. And in fact, the Supreme Court at one time, Tiny Krieger, in fact, in the 50s when there was redistricting, had to sit out for 2 years as a state senator because he did not have a district to run for.
In fact, I think his fellow Republicans purposely
Did that.
undid him
Yes,
by the
because he was
redistricting, didn't
a
they?
former member of the Progressive Party. He was quite a progressive Republican, moderate, and so they wanted to make that change. And we saw in the plan that was done in the 80s, the courts made specific mention of what was being suggested to them, where there were efforts to merge legislators or change numbers of legislative districts, that the districts were a community of interest, and that was not something that should be done. And so I don't think you even under close court scrutiny, that taking it and purposely dividing existing legislative districts would stand a lawsuit.
It seems in my experience that more than partisanship, legislators are interested in, first and foremost, a safe district for themselves.
Right.
Which has led to the fact, one of the reasons why it is so hard to defeat an incumbent.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think you're also right when you make the statement that's not necessarily partisan. Yes, that person may be a Democrat or a Republican, but should they leave office, it's not guaranteed that another Democrat or Republican would be elected. Now, there are certain districts where that's true. Probably the city of Madison currently is one of those, and the city of Milwaukee, where Democrats have great advantage. But you can't change that by redistricting unless you're going to take a long, narrow strip through the isthmus here and connect it with rural areas that are traditionally Republican. For whatever reason, geographically, the state does reflect political feelings based on geography. Democrats will occupy certain urban areas and Republicans certain suburban and rural areas. Northwestern part of the state, because of their tradition of co-ops and progressive farmers and so forth, has traditionally been Democratic. But yet, people need to look at history. If Dane County is a perfect example. You look at who represented the city of Madison in 1969 and look at who represented it in 1971 legislature. Total turnover from Republican to Democrat, with the exception of the state Senate. It happens, and those things do occur, and you'll see those boundaries shift. A lot of it's personality. Again, to just purposely try to either pair legislators or give them a weaker district, I think has a negative impact on our electoral process, rather than focusing on the issues and not looking at the personality.
Should mention one thing I meant to bring up before, the respect that the state legislative agencies are generally given by the legislature. To pick one that you are not directly involved in, or the Legislative Reference Bureau, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau,
Yes.
which provides the budget numbers, which is a heck of a job, because when they start on the biennial budget, they're really predicting the economy a year, 2.5 years ahead.
That's correct.
To the end of the following 2-year budget. Yet they've been remarkably accurate, and their numbers are generally accepted by everybody. Now, that's not the case in every state, is it?
Oh, no, it's not. Nor was it always here in Wisconsin. Department of Revenue used to do tax projections, influenced somewhat by the Department of Administration. The governor had their own numbers, would use those numbers to prepare their budget before they presented it to the legislature. Most often they did not agree with what our Legislative Fiscal Bureau, but history always proved our Legislative Fiscal Bureau tended to be more accurate. And I think it demonstrates the respect that, regardless of people's feelings, that we have an extremely partisan legislature, which in definition of the debate and the competition in elections and our turnover, that is true. But it has not been reflected in the staff services. And Bob Lang as director, and to his credit, and he's been there since 1977, so I could say he's responsible for the history of the agency, along with Dale Catno, who served as the first director, developed that expertise.
Now, in some states, they don't start with the same set of numbers for the budget, right? One house has one set, and the other house and the governor, they all have different projections. We have trouble getting a budget done when you start with the same numbers.
That is correct. And part of the history of the legislature for Wisconsin, too, is next year, the Joint Committee on Finance will have existed for 100 years in Wisconsin. Most states, I'll guess at 60%, I might be off on that a little, but they have separate finance committees for the Senate and the Assembly. They also have a separate committee for taxation versus appropriations, much like the federal government, where the House has the Ways and Means. And
4 committees instead of one.
And you have the appropriations instead of one. And so Wisconsin is unique in that aspect. I think it served the people of the state well. It allows for you to develop an agency such as the Legislative Fiscal Bureau with the expertise and the capacity to provide information to the legislature that's accurate, that they can rely upon, and make appropriate decisions.
On the other hand, the Joint Finance Committee gives 16 legislators tremendous power, more than most other legislators have. That's the plum to get on Joint Finance, right?
Well, it is, but it's also a great deal of work. Those people work extraordinarily hard on that committee. The hours that they spend, they have considerable power because they are there and working. But yet, I have seen members who paid particular attention to what finance is doing, not necessarily as a member, but working the halls, working their House representatives on that committee, and have been successful in influencing their decisions and having impact with what the Finance Committee does. It's been a delegation of some authority to that area, but it's certainly nothing you could do with 132 members as a committee, that you do need to delegate that authority somewhere.
Well, now, your most visible thing is being in front of the state Senate during sessions. So I want to, in addition to your administrative duties as the clerk, so I want to ask about some of those decisions
Okay.
that were made. And you know the one I'm thinking of, probably the most controversial vote of your tenure, really, the Milwaukee Brewers Stadium vote,
Yes.
which approved the 5-county special sales tax in the Milwaukee area to finance the stadium. This was a late night, all-night session. The legislature voted twice, once to approve it, and it went down by 1 vote, and then they voted to reconsider,
Yes.
and it failed again by 1 vote. Ordinarily, that would have been the end of things. Then you would recess till tomorrow, and that would have been the end. But in this case, as you well know, a recess was called, and it went on for hours, and I guess you helped them find a parliamentary way to get a 3rd vote. How did that, tell me what
Well,
went
I don't
on.
know that I helped them find the vote, but the fact is that you move reconsideration on a vote. If the question of reconsideration fails, that's the end. There's no second opportunity. But if you reconsider that first vote and you're now taking a new vote, that vote is in fact reconsiderable again.
I think you just lost me.
Okay. Let's say we voted on the bill. It failed 16-17. It required a member who voted with the majority, the 17 side, to move reconsideration. That was done. We then voted once again on final passage of the bill. Let me back up. Had we voted not to reconsider, when the question was, shall we reconsider the vote by which we failed to pass the Milwaukee Brewers Stadium bill, had that failed, there would have been no opportunity. There would have been no new vote on passage of the bill.
Oh, that was not what
That would have
happened?
been terminated. But what happened was the vote prevailed. We said, yes, we want to vote again. So we did vote again. Most often you would think, well, if someone's going to move to reconsider, they're going to change their vote, the bill would pass. So you never really saw it happen again. But what happened is the vote stayed exactly the same as the original one. Once again, the bill failed to pass. But it was again eligible for someone to move reconsideration if they wanted to do so, because it was a total new vote on passage of that bill. That's what allowed them to do it the second time and go forward to find whoever they could to change their vote.
Were you in on any of those meetings or where persuasion was levied?
Well, for the first meetings I was in on, of course, was can we move reconsideration again? And I was able to demonstrate to them through other rulings of the chair and other legislative manuals that yes, if the initial question to reconsider prevails, and you call that substantive question again, that question is subject to reconsideration once again. But we had never done that, so everyone was, of course, up in arms. There were many discussions going on at that time about who could change their vote, who should it be maybe, so that the majority party at that time, Republicans, didn't want to lose the majority. Is there somebody of our party that voted to kill the bill that we can get to change, but we want to make sure we can get them reelected again, that it will not cost them election?
For anyone who's watching and doesn't know the story, we should finish the story. George Petak, Republican of Racine,
Was the
is
one.
the one who changed his vote, and he became the only legislator ever to be successfully recalled.
That's
because
correct.
of that. His constituents obviously considered it a betrayal. It was a change in his position.
Yes.
And Speaker Wally Kinnicky at the time, though he was in the other house, said, this proves one of my rules. He said, never let anybody be identified as the deciding vote.
That's right.
And since he was the one who switched his vote, then he was...
And he was a very outspoken opponent of the proposal, and very outspoken about including Racine County as part of the special tax district to pay for the stadium. So it was somewhat of a unique experience for someone who had taken such a strong position. But somehow a decision was made by that caucus that Senator Petak was one because of his popularity in his district and everything else, could withstand re-election.
And a Democrat won the recall election, and that lost the Republicans their majority.
That is correct.
That was a huge vote.
And in hindsight, Senator Petak may have been successful had he been given the time till his re-election. And I think that was part of the decision-making factor.
Next year.
He was up, sometime down the road. They had not thought about the fact that someone would be successful in forcing a recall, and that how recalls in the state of Wisconsin were conducted was going to be changed, where we saw a great deal of money coming from outside the district to have people paid to go out and get the signatures and do different things to actually bring that election about. That was a whole different circumstance for the legislature to experience.
Well, that's something that you were not directly involved in, but the growth of big money in campaigns, and we've had $1 million state senate campaigns now, and there's nothing like that when you first started.
Oh, not at all.
Your thoughts on that?
Well, part of it, I think, is that technology and the media ability to get the word out and coverage for legislators has changed. And our laws have changed. If you look back at when I first began working for the legislature and was involved in legislative elections, you could go out and ask a local canning company for a donation of some vegetables, and go ask a local meat market for some bratwurst, hold a gathering where the candidate spoke, pass the hat, and collect a few ones, fives, and tens, and run a campaign. You didn't report that money, you bought a little radio time, maybe bought a newspaper ad, and you used a lot of shoe leather and volunteers to go out. You may even make your own signs. As we moved through, and cable television certainly had an impact, but the other technologies that became available to be used for campaigns, targeting of message that could be done, where you brought in resources to have professionals do polling of a particular district to develop a campaign, those things cost money. And as they began in an infancy, you came within restrictions on campaign financing, how you're going to report this money. Well, if I now have to track how I collected this money and report it, I need to spend more money to do that. So we again had a snowball effect. I could no longer sit in my basement and write "Elect Don Schneider" on a piece of cardboard and stick it up. I now had to, one, justify the cost. I had to put on there authorized and paid for, and all of that information. So we changed our culture, but again, we put these requirements on that required additional spending. The polling and that whole professional expertise that's been developed of a cottage industry to develop the message to influence an election has had a tremendous difference on how we campaign and what it costs to do so. Those things are not inexpensive. We do it now for legislative races that you just would have never dreamed of doing. You hardly did it for a statewide election 30 years ago, and now we do it for everything.
So all this new money in campaigns, or additional money, is that a bad thing?
It certainly changes, I think, how people look upon the electoral process. I think more important than even the money that's available for the campaign, it's how the message is developed. The fact that we've gone to the negative aspect of campaigning as opposed to the positive. In my career and when I began, candidates rarely mentioned their opponent's name. They rarely spoke of their opponent's position and would promote themselves and promote their particular positions on issues and why that was better for the state of Wisconsin. You could actually sit and read all the documentation and watch all of the ads, I think, today on a campaign and never really know what the candidate stands for, but you sure know what they're against or what is negative about them. Money allows that to happen, and I think it's somewhat how the money is used. With the Supreme Court decisions and everything else, it's obvious we're not going to get out from under the money. There's been discussions for 40 years that I've been around about trying to equalize the playing field, provide for public financing and doing other things of that sort to bring about a balance within the campaigns. But the court decisions have allowed the contributions limits to disappear. It'll now allow corporate contributions, which we have never had in the state of Wisconsin before, which just changes that development. I think it's part of, again, how the funds are used, but the freedom of speech of outside groups spending money that we enjoy, we need to deal with it. So the responsibility has to fall to the voter to try to shift through all of that information and make legitimate decisions on who will represent them. The efforts I think that we have made were meritorious to try to control, but it's obvious that the courts have decided it's unconstitutional, the direction we have gone, and that we need to move forward and just develop, and hopefully develop a culture to where we will see once again the positive campaign prevail as opposed to the negative.
You have real hopes of that? You're pretty optimistic.
Well, I think it can be done. I think you see it in some areas. Some members have been successful across the country in doing that. The attitude of people, although of course that shifts, but that there has been a feeling of this continuous negative thing, I really believe we might see that happen this time. It's not just the gridlock, but it's part of the negative activity, statements that have come out that have people frustrated with the federal level and their state elected officials.
Negative campaigning apparently works, or they wouldn't do it, would they?
Well, it's clear. I mean, Pepsi would never mention Coke in their ad, and now, Coke's almost written better than Pepsi by the time the ad's over, but you don't want to drink Coke when you're done. For whatever reason, human nature has seemed to focus on the negative aspects that are being sent out, and we make some decisions on that. I'd like to believe that that culture can be changed and that we'll see more positive activity and bring about people talking more about the issues. The last presidential election, I think we saw more of a debate on positive aspects of issues than truly bringing out all negatives. That helped change an attitude. It's not going to happen overnight, maybe not in my lifetime anymore. But you've got people, I think we talked about him earlier, Tim Cullen running a campaign, and I expect will be done on a more positive vein. Certainly never seen Fred Risser run a negative campaign against any of his opponents, even in a primary where he was faced maybe with a tough re-election. And so people can do that, and hopefully it will once again prevail. And that candidates themselves need to get to these special interest groups that have more of a desire to run the special interest message of negative
that's part of
nature.
the problem. The candidates have lost control.
Yes.
The first $1 million Senate race we had, I believe, was John Erpenbach's race. It must be, 12 years ago now.
Right.
And Erpenbach was the fourth leading spender. He was outspent not only by his Republican opponent, but by the teachers union and Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce.
Yes.
And he won, even though he was the fourth spender, so maybe that was good. But
yeah. The money's there. They've been successful. They're going to continue to receive contributions to do that effort because of that. And the candidate themselves do need to take a responsibility, I think, to address that. We have seen some where they have come forward to disassociate themselves and actually call upon certain groups to pull those ads and take them off the air. More of that needs to be done.
Before we're done, I wanted to ask you, from your vantage point at the front of the Senate chamber, we talked about the Brewer Stadium vote, but what other interesting things have you seen from that point of view that you might want to share?
Well, one, it was a great point of view. I enjoyed every minute I spent in that chamber, and I was always there at the podium when the session was convened. The very first one that I recall being somewhat uneasy for me as a parliamentary decision, but to watch the dynamics of the body, was campaign finance. And Bill Bablich was the majority leader at that time. He was a big promoter of public financing in the state of Wisconsin, and it was his bill. It came to the floor for a vote. We had an absent member. It was a 16-16 vote, and in early At that time yet, the constitutional amendment had not been ratified. So this was early '79. The lieutenant governor presided and had a casting vote to break the tie vote. The lieutenant governor voted to no, to kill the bill. He was a Republican, was not in favor of public financing, and the vote did not prevail and the bill died. I later discovered that the governor was not available in the state of Wisconsin at that time, and under the interpretations at that time, the governor was no longer in the state of Wisconsin. The lieutenant governor became acting governor. And the acting governor, due to separation of powers, could not, in fact, preside and vote in the state legislature. So I brought that forward, had a discussion with the lieutenant governor about that. They, of course, had their attorneys work on the issue. I drafted my position on that, and a point of order was raised and discussed on the floor, and it was determined that the vote was null and void, that the lieutenant governor could not vote. A reconsideration motion was made because on a tie vote, either side can move to reconsider, and ultimately the bill was passed and signed into law.
Again, another 17-16
Another
vote.
17-16 vote. And we saw a lot of them. The Democrats had a greater majority at that time. It was 1914, so it was not a pure straight party vote on that particular issue.
But at later times, there has been a 17-16 partisan
Oh, yes.
split. As we said, the George Petak recall turned the Senate around. So.
Yes. 3 times during my tenure, we changed party control during the middle of a session, the first time being with the recall of Senator Petak. We had this occur due to vacancies at special elections as a result of the vacancies that occurred. So we stayed 17-16, became a 16-16 body on 3 different occasions right in the middle of the budget process. Very unique, and fortunately, the legislative leaders had the foresight, and we were able to develop a rule to address that issue, because many states have had gridlock. When they're tied, neither side wants to give up the majority. They don't want to compromise on how to proceed, and we developed rules to make it very clear who would preside and who would maintain committee chairmanships and what our proportional representation will be, so we could continue to function and have the budget process move forward, continue to debate and pass legislation, and didn't experience the gridlock. When it
got down to 16-16, the party that had previously been in control continued until the result of whatever?
For all practical purposes, yes, but there was an equalization of the membership of the committees. The former majority party continued as presiding officer and so forth.
But the committees got equal representation, though the chairs remained the previous
That's correct.
Party. That must have been difficult to negotiate.
It was, and it actually occurred just prior to us convening a new session, because the foresight was we were going to wind up being tied because of vacancies that we knew were going to occur. And we normally would convene at 2 in the afternoon. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I actually secured the signatures from the leaders from both parties to introduce the new rules.
Now, you're not an attorney.
No, I'm not.
But you've certainly become an expert on parliamentary procedure. That's really not quite the same thing.
No, it's
so
not.
It's legalistic.
It's legalistic, more constitutional law and parliamentary procedure, and the precedents have been established. I enjoy it. I studied it. It was something that I like to do. So I've read the history of the U.S. Congress and certainly studied all of the case history available for any Wisconsin decisions. One of the
because
first
we should make clear, just as a court looks at precedents, in this case you would have precedents from previous decisions made by presiding officers.
Not only those decisions that may have been made by the courts, even though they don't look at our internal proceedings, there are certain constitutional requirements we must meet that have been litigated, and we look at those.
Now ultimately it's the decision of the presiding officer, the Senate President. But do they always take your advice?
No. The presiding, and I maybe should have spoke, the presiding officers, the presidents of the Senate who have been elected members of the Senate always did. Marty Schreiber, when he was lieutenant governor and presided, always did. Marty was also a good parliamentarian. Lieutenant Governor Olson, who had formerly served in the Assembly, a little different culture there as to how the majority and minority party related to each other and how decisions were made, would often make a partisan decision. I could turn to him and say, this is what we should do, and he might say something else. But that's the only time that that really occurred.
Any other things you saw from the front of the chamber, that
Well,
other votes? Or?
We had one very unique point of order raised also that maybe even of more interest than the others, and it was on redistricting. The bill was before the Senate. They were very cautious as to whether they were going to have the votes to pass the plan. They took the vote. It failed. Now, under the Senate procedures, all members must be seated when they vote. The clerk calls their name, they respond, it's recorded. At the conclusion of the vote, the clerk would announce all members have voted either in the affirmative or negative, and then read the short side, the losing side. I did that on that particular vote. Senator Bablich, as majority leader, rose in his seat to raise a point of order. Or raise a parliamentary inquiry, how did the senator from the 31st vote? I responded. He then raised the point of order that the senator from the 31st was not in his seat. How could he have voted? Well, what happened was he voted, got up and walked out, which he was not supposed to do.
We're not supposed to do that, no.
But it created a circumstance where the presiding officer had to take the question under advisement. We recessed while he did that, allowed the majority leader to secure that extra vote to pass that bill.
So the presiding officer at that time was Fred Risser?
Yes.
Yeah, because the Democrats were in power.
Yes.
But we should emphasize once again the difference in the cultures. The Senate is much more formal. Are men still required to wear a coat and tie?
Yes, not a tie, but a coat.
Okay, and when the first two women were elected, the question was what garb would they wear?
Yes.
And they elected, I believe, Catherine Morrison and Michelle Radosevich elected to wear the equivalent of sport coats to show, I don't know, solidarity or being members of the club.
Respect for the rules of the House. And others continued that. I think even today yet you will see most female members enter the chamber with some form of a blazer on. And the only change that was made to accommodate the growing number of female members was a request made that we change the rule which related to no hats. Because there are certain members, in particular Gwen Moore, African American heritage, who traditionally wore a hat and wanted to wear a hat on certain days in the Senate chambers. So the body agreed and did make that change.
The legislature has pretty well accommodated women, hasn't it?
Yes. One,
the bathroom for the assembly.
The bathroom
yes.
that you remember, there was only one bathroom, restroom was in the Senate chambers. If we had a call of the House, we locked the doors. Members could not leave the precincts of the Senate, and there was no restroom for the female senators that were elected, which did not occur until 1975, so we had to make modifications to accommodate a restroom for our female members. Even though we had a large number of female employees, it never occurred to anyone to make the accommodations.
Well, let's talk about, you've been active in the national organizations. There are national organizations of clerks,
Yes.
and the other one is what?
National Conference of State Legislatures.
American Society of Legislative Clerks and Secretaries, and the National Conference of State Legislatures. Tell us about those.
Well, there are two organizations of which all 50 states are members. The National Conference of State Legislatures, the state actually appropriates money in the budget to pay an annual dues. All members, all staff are part of that conference. The American Society of Legislative Clerks and Secretaries has a longer history. It actually began in 1947. And the clerks, because it's a very unique occupation, there's only 99 clerks, or if you count the federal level, 101 of us in the country.
That's because Nebraska only has one house.
Only has one house.
People are trying to do the math.
So they began sharing their ideas, precedence on rulings of the chair, and formed an organization at that time and continued it without any contribution from the states. It was solely by individual members getting together once a year to discuss the issues. And it expanded as the legislatures hired more staff and the responsibilities of the clerks increased to be more administrative than solely being a record keeper as specified in the Constitution, that it's now will hold a conference of 300 plus people. Excuse me. And it is also part of the National Conference of State Legislatures. And they meet once a year with the conference. They elect their own officers. Rob Marchant, who's my successor, will serve as president of the American Society of Legislative Clerks and Secretaries next year.
The current Senate clerk.
The current Senate clerk, I'm very proud of that. He's only been here for 6 years, and he's had an impact with the organization that he'll assume leadership.
Now, you were the staff chair of the National Conference. What does that mean?
Well, the conference is very unique in that it's legislatures and not a conference of legislators. So staff and members are part of the organization and share in the responsibility of governance. So there is a president of the conference that is an elected member of the legislature, and there is a staff chair that is a staff person to the legislature. I was very privileged and honored to have the honor to serve as staff chair in 1993. You have an important role in governance of that conference, giving direction as to what resources will be made available to the states for training programs for legislative staff, what conferences are scheduled throughout the year for legislative staff, and of course provides many opportunities to meet with your colleagues from other states. Wisconsin has had a strong tradition of being part of that. Bonnie Reese, who is our long-serving Executive Secretary of the Legislative Council, was the second staff chair and the first woman to serve as staff chair for the conference. It was organized in 1977 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We've had Steve Miller serve in that capacity, who's now chief of the Legislative Reference Bureau. We've had Terry Anderson, who's now Secretary of the Legislative Council. All have the pleasure of serving in that capacity, as well as my good friend Dale Catno, who served in that capacity. So Wisconsin's had an important role.
Has this helped a lot, the state and the staff? So?
Absolutely. It's brought resources to the state through the national conference, brought attention to us. It's allowed us to use resources from the organization to assist in how we developed the program to increase the capacity of this legislative body. But also Wisconsin's recognized around the country. Many of our members are asked to speak at many conferences throughout the country or go directly into states and meet with legislative leaders, as well as our staff directors have been, to help them in increasing their capacity.
So Wisconsin's a leader?
Yes, absolutely, no question about it.
And have been really from the start, going back to
from
1901.
Yes, no question.
Well, and bring us up to date on what you're doing now. You're working with international groups now?
Yes, it actually started, John, back in the mid-'80s. The U.S. Agency for International Development began focusing on assisting developing democracies. At that time, it focused in Central America and South America. Through one of the speeches I made at a conference, and Alan Weinstein from the Center for Democracy, which was associated with the Boston College, had a grant to do some work through the college in Central America, and he contacted me about providing assistance for that. We brought in other clerks on that project through the American Society of Legislative Clerks and Secretaries, and that led to a number of projects. We started in Guatemala, and we literally went through all of Central America. We went into Nicaragua days after the elections there when the Sandinistas lost control. We were in El Salvador when they were still flying gunships around, working with their parliament to develop their rules and train staff and bring technology to that part of the world. It continued all through my career. The Wisconsin Senate, when we were out of session, would allow me to take leave of absence or use my vacation time to travel on projects throughout the world. So I've had, again, the privilege and honor to go the globe. I moved from Central America and South America after communism fell to Eastern Europe and went across all the way through Ukraine and Soviet Union, Belarus, then into Africa, then into the Baltics, into the Middle East, and most recently I've done projects in Pakistan and Iraq, and now with Kenya, as we have a delegation here now.
Yeah, as to today, you're going around with a Kenyan delegation.
Yes, yes.
Well, let's start with the Middle East. You want to bring democracy to the Middle East. How do we go about that?
Well, it's interesting that the most difficult one I worked with was actually Palestinian Legislative Council. Now, they do not have their own country, but under the Norway Agreement, they were given some autonomy and authority and created a legislature. But they had no experience, no history in the entire existence of the Palestinian people of self-governance of this sort. I had the occasion to go over there, and I actually spent 30 days there to help them write their rules of procedure and develop a process for maintaining the official record. I witnessed their debates, in fact watched Chairman Arafat speak to the group. They would agree to do something, kind of like almost in a tribal discussion format. Yes, let's do that. Walk out happy that they did something. No record maintained, and no communication ever sent anywhere to say,
no follow-through.
We're going to do this. But they just didn't have that culture. So that was really developing something totally from grassroots, working with academics and the staff at hand to bring a legislative culture there. We introduced some computer systems. This was in '97. To assist them with doing the records. We drafted rules, got them processed for communicating with the ministries of government and forming more of a parliamentary type system there. Pakistan, being a former British entity, actually has the British form of government. And in fact, it went as far at the national level to have a bicameral legislature. Kenya is facing a vote next week. I'm breaking from the traditional parliamentary form of government and creating a presidential legislative separation of powers doctrine in their constitutional amendment, which will be a total different experience for them. So they are here to observe and get some concept of how do two houses relate to each other, and how do you provide staff services, and what do we do with this new Senate and National Assembly.
How well have these worked? I'm thinking that in the news right now, the Iraqi parliament can't even agree to meet.
Yes, yes.
There's a long way to go on these.
Oh, there is, and you have some successes, you have some failures. I think some of the greatest things I've taken out of it is that the very first project I worked on in Guatemala, we went in there to create a process for them to create their records, to strengthen the role of the legislative staffing and the clerk, enhance the ability for the public. Transparency in government is a major effort that we go forward with when we go into these projects. After we did this, and it was headlines in the paper, the official documents were available the day after the session, you could see the record, they published them. They went through their election cycle, and the first time in the history of Guatemala that they have a transition of government without military intervention. And we've seen that happen now in a number of areas across the world. And it's largely these projects. And Wisconsin, not just myself, but other people. Bob Lang's been to Nigeria. Steve Miller's been to a number of places. Terry Anderson has. They've shared their experiences. We have a rich history of hosting delegations here. Kenya today may not be moving forward with the reforms they are to provide a more responsive government had it not been for the fact that their clerk lived in Wisconsin for 4 months and served as an intern in the state Senate, worked with my staff, gained the experience of a bicameral legislature, a transparent, open legislature. He's made tremendous changes and impact since he became the clerk of the National Assembly now that reflect what he saw and observed here. So So I think we're having some positive impacts, certainly in the area of transparency and creating an official record for these legislative bodies.
You can't go in and fix things, though. I mean, as I say, the Iraqi parliament can't even agree to meet as we're sitting here right now, and there's only so much you can do. But
there is, and politics is politics. We professionalize our staff. They provide great service here. We're transparent, but yet we cannot control the fact that maybe a bill's not going to pass or wind up being deadlocked between the two houses, or that you have the partisan conflict that you have. I think what's important is that the process is there, that the people have confidence in the records that are being maintained and in their legislative institution, that as opposed to going to arms and throwing out the legislature, they continue to elect and using the power of the ballot to bring in different legislative groups that will respond better to them.
So
I think we're making that progress, yes.
Well, to wrap up here, do you have anything that I have not brought up?
We've probably gone on considerable time, but we could spend hours.
I'm getting ready for the final question, which is, what advice would you have for a young person today who's interested in politics, either elective or staff position? Would you go into it today if you were a young person?
Well, the legislative career, I think, is one of the most rewarding that an individual can have. If you have an interest in government and even in politics, there's no better place to observe it. But the opportunities to influence decisions that make our lives and be involved in that on a day-to-day basis, and to help people as they bring forward a grievance, whether it's just someone who has a zoning problem with construction on their property up on a lake in northern Wisconsin, or has a major issue, or a school group that comes forward and says, you know, blind people can't see the buttons on the elevator, maybe we ought to have Braille, and you actually impact people's lives by bringing forward legislation and making those changes. It's the legislature where you have that opportunity. I don't think any other part of government allows you the flexibility to really impact people's lives, and it's very rewarding to do so. It's hard work, it's a lot of hours, there's frustrations that you're not successful all the time. Even if you're managing the legislative institution and trying to bring about new computer systems and more effective ways of doing things, what Patrick and Rob, current clerks, are doing in consolidating efforts and reducing costs. You're not always successful, but you continue to strive, but you have the ability to really impact something that is closest to the people. There's no greater wonder than to have people walk into that Capitol for the very first time in their lives and to say to them, you're welcome. You can stand here. This is your legislative chambers. Feel free to take your photograph. Your legislative member's office is down the hall. Go talk to them. If you have an issue that you'd like to express, feel free to do that. And that you can do that and be part of that.
When I was privileged to cover the legislature, I always thought it was the richest beat that a reporter could have, because the federal government, Congress, is so big and the demands of time are so great that getting into interview a congressperson, for example, I mean, it is such a hassle. But the state legislators are generally available. They'll return phone calls, you can walk in their office and talk to them, and they have real clout.
Yes.
Local officials might not quite, you know, they're easily accessible too, but may not quite have that kind of clout. But the legislature does, and they are accessible. Very
accessible, and I think that's one thing that people in Wisconsin should be very proud of when they, even though they may look upon their legislature at times in a negative view, the fact that their elected official is on the streets and maybe in their coffee shops, or they can stop them and talk to them, they can write to them, they do answer their phones, they do appear at almost any invitation that you want to have your legislator present at a meeting, regardless of the size or the issue, that they would not make an effort to be at.
And almost every issue will sooner or later come before the legislature.
Yes, it does.
And in fact, in the budget, everybody puts everything.
It seems like everything is in that one document. You're correct.
So for a young person starting out, is there a course of a college degree, or you just go to the legislature and say,
well,
can I be a page?
Education is extremely important, but particularly for people who choose to come to Madison for their education and are here, they ought to look at the Capitol as a place for part-time employment as a legislative page, because it's a very good experience to really observe the legislative process. There's also opportunities through the political science department, not only at Madison, but sometimes at the outlying campuses, to intern with an elected official. Spend some time in their office, and maybe you will be the person who writes issue papers on a particular issue or tracks a bill through the legislative process as part of that semester's activity, and you get credit for it as part of your education. Great opportunities that way. But then seriously look at, and regardless of what your degree may be, and it doesn't need to be political science, whatever government, if you have an interest in public service, look at the legislature. All too often people do not. And it is a very difficult place to work. The hours are demanding. You're entitled to the same fringe benefits of a state employee, but you do not have civil service protection, whether you're in a service agency or in a clerk's office. Sometimes people have difficulty with that issue, but most of our people, as you know, John, are long-serving. They've been here a long time because they work hard and they produce. You really have the opportunity in the legislature to express yourself and to grow and have an impact. And I would encourage any young people that have an interest in public service, look at the legislature first. There's not always a lot of opportunities, but be persistent. Contact your clerk's office, contact your elected official. Maybe they'll have an opportunity within their own office. If you're in the, have the skills of a librarian or a research or an attorney, certainly look at our legislative service agencies. Budget people, the accountants ought to look at our Legislative Audit Bureau and our Fiscal Bureau. Again, it's a very demanding, the hours that the Fiscal Bureau and these agencies can put in, but extraordinarily rewarding. I cannot think of another career that would allow me the ability to grow and have the experiences that I did in the 33 and a half years I spent in the Capitol. I wouldn't want to replace those years for anything.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Wonderful talk. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.